Good morning. We're going to get started in just a minute. If we can have folks get your refreshments, find your seats. I think you can go ahead and call to order.
Okay, shall we go?
The mic on? Yep.
Good morning. I have an official script, so I will try to follow it, which is not the way I usually roll. But so the California Racial Equity Commission Framework Development Committee is officially called to order. It's about 9:10 on Thursday, March 20th. A few reminders for people in person or online. We are providing interpretation services in Spanish, both in person and online for this meeting. If you're speaking at today's meeting as a commissioner, presenter, panelist, or member of the public, delivering public comments, we ask you, if you're speaking in English, to speak a bit more slowly so that our interpreters can follow. Y para decir en español que tenemos interpretación para esta reunión por la internet, pero también en persona. Entonces yo creo que hay máquinas que se pueden recoger del cuarto y si hay algún problema, déjanos saber. Second, as we continue to engage guest speakers, presenters, and the public, we want to name that the information and opinions expressed by presenters or public commenters before the commission reflect the views of the speaker. They do not necessarily represent the views of the commission, which are still in formation actually, or the governor's Office of Land Use and Climate Innovation. As a public body, public comment is critical to the work of the commission, and we allow public comment at all meetings. However, we stand united with other Californians in condemning hate and recognizing the harm that hate causes. Hate act is hostile expression or action committed in whole or in part because of a person's actual or perceived identities or characteristics, including race, color, disability, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, or gender, including gender identity, and or because that person is part of a protected group. The rich diversity of California is one of our assets, and we're committed to supporting and protecting all people in California. So make comments, do not make hate statements. If you're a victim or witness to hate, racism, or bullying, you can report the incident and receive free support through the California Hate Resource Line. Hotline will help you identify next steps, help you connect to resources. And the number for that is 833-8-NO-HATE, N-O-H-A-T-E, or you can visit California versus Hate, CAVSHate.org. So we want to begin with a land acknowledgement. I want to begin with another acknowledgement to the Imperial Valley Equity and Justice Coalition for this wonderful book that some of you may have, Southern Winds. If you're a commissioner and you have not picked this up, this will give you a way to really understand what's going on in the Imperial Valley, particularly from the perspective of younger folks in the Imperial Valley. And it's a huge asset. So for example, I looked at our land acknowledgement for today, and I said, I think we're missing some people. So I went to members of the Imperial Valley Equity and Justice Coalition, and yes, we would have missed a few people. So we recognize the traditional territory of the Kumeyaay people who've inhabited the area for over 9,000 years and honor their continued presence and connection to the land. But I think it's also important to mention some of the indigenous folks that have also been part of the general area, Salton Sea area, the Quechan, the Cahuilla, the Kupa, and the Paipai, as well as the Kumeyaay. With all those people, we acknowledge that we are guests on traditional homelands. We pay respects to their ancestors and communities, past and present, and we realize that no future can be created without their presence and their voice. So, our agenda for this meeting covers 6 agenda items. We have hard copies of the agenda and other relevant meeting materials available in the room. They're also available online at racialequity.lci.ca.gov. Let me turn things over to Dr. Larissa Estes to provide a brief overview of the agenda for the meeting. And Dr. Estes, if you wouldn't mind also describing a little bit about the community meeting last night that prefaced this particular meeting, which I think was one of the richest exchanges I've had the privilege to be a part of.
Thank you, Dr. Pastor. And bringing into the space the community that we spent time with last night. We had about 72 people in this room, and not just sharing information about the Youth Empowerment Commission or the Racial Equity Commission, but mainly wanting to create space for community to share their experiences, their stories, and really had some powerful themes come up around immigration, farm worker rights, gender equity, racism and discrimination, but so many of the things that the community down here experiences, we've heard from throughout the state, and it continues to be the reminder why the Racial Equity Commission is committed to moving throughout the state and making sure that we hear and capture stories that may not always be told in the mainstream. And so it was a powerful and really moving experience last night. If I look really tired, it's because I really took on the energy and the love and just the commitment you see people have to the communities that they work for and work in. And so it was a wonderful experience and glad to have been part of it and to have had that with the community here in Imperial County and throughout the Imperial Valley. Our agenda for today, we are currently on agenda item 1, which is our welcome. We will then transition to public comments on matters not on the agenda. If you have a public comment, please complete the public comment card, or you can complete a public comment card online. We will then go into a presentation by Stephen Menendian, the Assistant Director of the Othering and Belonging Institute, to talk more about communications and the practical application of racial equity strategies and really give us some grounding in the thinking of what the narrative should be or what we should consider around narrative, but also what are the considerations that the commission should have in building out its racial equity framework. We'll take about a 15-minute recess and then transition back into a dialogue with Commissioners Pastor and Richardson on some of the key considerations and additional research that the team needs to do to help build out a racial equity framework, where our goal is to continue to engage community, engage the commission and its committees and other subject matter experts to make sure we're really building out a tool that is impactful and is something that we can actually move the needle on racial equity forward. We'll then have a follow-up on next steps and close out with adjournment. And with that, I turn it back to you, Commissioner Pastor.
Great, and I'll say a word about that meeting last night too. I think what was super useful for the commissioners to take away is that the stuff people are concerned about is very immediate and very lived. It's about the treatment of farm workers and the environmental risks they face. It's about the issues of disability and the access or lack thereof. It's about questions about mixed status families in an era in which the threats of deportation are real. It's about the role of art in young people expressing their sense of what's going on. And one of the things I think I particularly take away from the meeting yesterday is that sometimes when we think about racial equity from a state perspective, it's about the way state agencies will be designed. But from an on-the-ground perspective, it's about opportunity, it's about dignity, it's about community. It's very, very grassroots and immediate. It's not about the language we use and whether or not it's politically correct. It's about whether or not there's a difference made in people's lives. And I think it's important for us to take that charge seriously. So I'm going to, I guess, turn things over to Augustine Areola to do a roll call to make sure that the two of us who are here are actually here. So, Augustine?
Thank you, Commissioner Pastor. I will begin roll call with yourself. Commissioner Dr. Manuel Pastor.
Here.
Commissioner Yolanda Richardson.
Here.
Thank you. We have both committee members here with us today. We have achieved quorum. Note that Commissioner Richardson is following the teleconference rules for advisory bodies outlined under Government Code 11123.5, which allows members to participate remotely. Under this code, commissioners are required to remain on screen throughout the meeting. Thank you to everyone joining us today, in person or online. I'm here to provide some guidance for the processes of this hybrid meeting, which we have designed with the intention of maximizing access by members of the public. Please note, we are providing Spanish interpretation services in person and online for this meeting. Estamos proporcionando servicios de interpretación en español, tanto en persona como en línea para esta. Si nos acompañan a través de Zoom, localice la barra de herramientas en la parte inferior de la ventana de Zoom. Busque el botón que dice Interpretación, que puede aparecer como un icono de globo terráqueo. Haga clic en el botón Interpretación para acceder a las opciones de interpretación de idiomas. Aparecerá una ventana emergente con una lista de idiomas disponibles para la interpretación. Ahí puede seleccionar Español. For those joining the webinar online via Zoom or by phone, please note that your microphone is automatically muted when you join. To minimize the risk of background noise, you will not be able to unmute yourself. For those joining online via Zoom, please note the webinar platform doesn't enable video for attendees, so we will not be able to see you. If you need technical assistance during the meeting or have a question about the meeting processes, there are a few ways to contact us. If you are online via Zoom, the best way is by using the Q&A function, with several members of the Racial Equity Commission team monitoring it. If you joined by phone and you have access to email, please email racialequitycommission@opr.ca.gov. To make an in-person public comment, you can pick up a comment card at the public comment staff table and return it to one of our staff members. You will need to submit a public comment card for each item you wish to speak on. If you plan to make public comment virtually, you must be online via Zoom, either through the webinar or phone option. To submit an online public comment, you can go to racialequity.lci.ca.gov/meetings/ and complete the public comment form link there. You'll need to complete a separate form for each item on which you wish to speak. You may complete a form at any time during the meeting. When the public comment period for your item opens, we will call on your name. When you hear your name, please raise your hand on Zoom. To do this online in the Zoom webinar, click Raise Hand under the Participants menu. You can find that at the bottom of your screen. To raise your hand by phone, press star 9. When it is your turn to speak, a member of our team will unmute your microphone. If you are online, you will see a window pop up alerting you that the host is unmuting you. You will need to click that option to approve unmute. After that, you can begin your comment. If you are on via your phone, you will hear a recorded message alerting you that your line is unmuted. You can begin your comment once your line is unmuted. Each speaker will have a maximum of 2 minutes to make their remarks. Speakers requiring or using interpretation services are allotted 4 minutes to facilitate full participation. If you are online, you'll see a timer pop on your screen. Please monitor that and wrap up your remarks accordingly. If you are unable to complete an online form but would like to make a public comment, please email racialequitycommission@opr.ca.gov. Thank you. Back to you, Chair Pastor.
Thank you. I'm going to open up for public comment in a minute. I just want to say to Commissioner Richardson, my getting here involved flying from Canada, which was kind of a tough thing. But I know your schedule, and it's a bit of a miracle that you've been able to come on virtually with everything you've got going on today. So thank you very much for making it. So we're going to open up now for any public comments related to item number 1. Welcome. If you don't have any comments about that, we'll immediately move on to any comments about stuff that's not on the agenda. Just as a rule, you'll have 2 minutes for your comments. The script tells me that if you go for more than 2 minutes, I'm supposed to gently interrupt and say, can you please wrap up your comment on this item? And then for the audience, if the person then keeps on going and it's like 2.5 minutes, I'm going to raise both my hands. And that is a signal for you all to thunderously applaud that comment because clearly that person was just coming to their finale. So with that, are there any comments on agenda item number 1, the welcome?
There are no virtual or in-person public comments for item number 1.
Thank you. Before we move to the rest of our agenda items, are there any public comments about items not on the agenda today?
There are no virtual public comments. Are there any in-person public comments?
Is there one? Yes.
Looks like we have one in-person public comment. Microphone over here.
Good morning. My name is Daniela Flores, and I'm one of the co-founders for Imperial Valley Equity and Justice Coalition. I'm going to read a community description, background that we have, just mainly so that we can provide some context around the area for any folks that are maybe less familiar. And just cut me off at the 2 minute. Well, I'll cut myself off at 2 minutes, but I don't know if I can make it. But I did just want to, again, for anybody that wasn't here last night, just another welcome to our community in Imperial County. I hope that this is the first of many visits and that you're able to kind of maybe explore. I'm not sure what the whole program is around between the day, but hopefully you'll be able to get to see some of the other neighborhoods and communities outside of the city of Imperial. And so I'll read this just for some background around our community. So we're bordered by the Salton Sea at our north, the Colorado River in our east, and Mexico to our south. And the Imperial Valley is a vibrant binational community with the rich culture and resilience that characterize immigrant communities. Across a range of domains of disadvantage, economic hardship, public disinvestment, low health access, environmental pollution, and heat risk, Imperial top state list illustrating the intersection between racial and social injustice. A century of racialized extractive labor in farm work and mining have impoverished our families, sickened our bodies, and polluted our air and water. With the second highest unemployment rate in the state, Imperial's median household income is less than 60% of the state median household income. And this is considering our community's larger than average multi-generational households. Employment is concentrated in the seasonal, part-time, and low-benefit sectors of agriculture, health, and social assistance, and commercial retail. Economic hardship in employment is reflected in housing. A full 45% of county households are rent burdened, meaning that they spend over 30% of their monthly income on rent. Oh my God, that was 2 minutes, right? So thank you so much.
Are
That
there
was
any?
far more disciplined than any academic I've ever seen. But I hope that you'll take advantage of other comments and your rest of your team will to finish that picture and also to provide a picture of the exciting civic efforts that are taking place in this moment to try to change that situation, because I think those are an inspiration for the work of the state. So, Augustine, do we have any other public comments?
Yes, we have one more in-person public comment. Luis Omeldo from Comité Cívico.
Good morning. Good morning, Luis Olmedo. I'm the Executive Director of Comité Cívico del Valle. We're a community-based organization. My comment is probably just a general comment. I'd like to assure that the Commission knows that there is an interest of environmental justice. As an organization, we've been here 35 plus years. We've began our endeavor stemming from the inequalities, disadvantages that stem from the farm worker, just, I guess, historical discriminatory practices, unfair labor conditions, unfair environmental conditions. I also like to put in the center the subject of lithium and energy. And while that's the flavor of the day, that's the next best thing. That's what's going to lift us from poverty and inequalities and all the things that are very well documented that put us among the worst served communities in the entire country and in California. We've seen a lot of the next best things come in and go. And one of the things that I've asked this commission to please consider is that as you carry on your mission, your endeavor of bringing racial equity or addressing the inequalities, that a lot of times state contributes to that in it, sadly not engaging in facilitated conversations to assure that we have fair community benefits. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Augustine, do we have any other in-person or online comments?
There are no more in-person public comments.
Great, thank you. And I think this moves us to agenda item number 3, which will be a research presentation, communications, and practical implementation of racial equity strategies. And for this agenda item, we're joined virtually by someone whose work I respect deeply, Stephen Menendian, who's Assistant Director of the Othering and Belonging Institute. Stephen, thank you for being here. Good to see you virtually. Wish we were seeing you in person. So let me turn things over to you. Let's see, you may still have your mute on.
You know, I think I'm having some technical audio problems, so I'm doing the audio through my phone and then the video through my computer. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you just fine, thank you.
Great. Thank you. Good morning, commissioners. Dr. Estes, it's great to be here with you. I'm excited to share some of these principles and insights and hopefully help the work of this commission as it carries out this really important work for the state and the communities within this state. I'm about to go to the screen share. Hopefully that works, even though the audio on my computer is not.
It's working fine. You need to move it into slide mode.
Yes. Great. All right. Thank you again. So I'm just going to go over a couple of things this morning. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about DEIB and just ground ourselves in those differences. I'm going to talk about some legal parameters around these practices and processes, and then I'm going to talk about some principles, both narratively and then also practically. So, the commissioners are very familiar with this, but this is something that I was told would be helpful to go over again. So, the DEI acronym generally stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. There are sometimes variants of it, DEIA, DEIB. Just to ground us all, diversity is a multidimensional concept or principle that basically describes the representation and ratio of representation of groups, social identity groups within a space, a community, or an institution. And there are actually ways to quantitatively measure this. One is known as the Teal Index. Sometimes it's just eyeballed, but this is both a qualitative and quantitative concept. And one expression or way of advancing this principle is to try and increase representation of underrepresented groups within particular institutions such as colleges and universities. And as a principle, diversity is intended to generally both, again, increase representation, but it's also designed to produce better outcomes. So it's an end and it's a means. And there's a lot of research that suggests that diverse groups often are able to overcome the problems of groupthink and produce better outcomes and better products. Equity is different than diversity, and these ideas get conflated. Equity is moving beyond formal equality of treatment, that based on the recognition that sometimes different but fair treatment is required in order to produce just outcomes. So this isn't treating people discriminatorily, but it is treating people differently based upon their different situations or their different needs. So for example, you might, in schools, some students qualify for IEPs, which gives them access to additional resources and supports. And we recognize that individuals and groups need separate supports in a variety of contexts. So, for example, students who are English language learners or parents who are English language learners may receive materials in translated or in their home language. And so there are all sorts of reasons to provide tailored treatment to groups. This is basically the essence of equity. Inclusion is a really simple concept to understand. It's simply allowing members of formally excluded groups into institutions, organizations, or communities. And so DEI are very different ideas, but they, in practice, often get housed together within DEI offices or helmed by programs that are operated or administered by DEI officers. Just to ground everyone in belonging, again, for those who are unfamiliar with this concept, in a sense, belonging is to inclusion what equity is to equality. It's an evolution, an expansion of the concept. It is an attempt to ground people who may be included in an institution, but may not feel a sense of connection or feel fully served or empowered within that context. So, this is a kind of a visual that we often use that help people really see the contrast. So on the left-hand side, you have an image of exclusion where the institution does not allow people of certain social identities within, and then inclusion allows them within, but it maintains the norms, the habitus, the programming of the original institution, whereas belonging is a reconfiguration of that institution. Again, either its norms, its programming, its core values, whatever the case may be. It doesn't mean that it necessarily has to be reconstituted, but it does mean that there is an opportunity for reconstitution. And so we have identified 4 critical elements to belonging. The first is just, again, inclusion. The second is recognition, which is when an institution or a community sees people not just as individuals, but also their social identities and recognizes their social identities as such. And then connection is the reciprocal element of this, which is that when people feel seen and feel heard, they are more likely to have a sense of affiliation with the institution or community to which they belong. And then finally, they need to be empowered within that context. So we often talk about the guest model. If you go to a party and you're a guest of the party, you're included in the party, but you're not necessarily empowered to decide what's being served, what the programming of the party is. Belonging is more like being a party planner rather than being a guest at the party. Being a guest at the party is provisional and limited, whereas full agency means that you're empowered to participate fully in the life of the organization or institution. So this is how we think about belonging. And unfortunately, all these things get conflated together, DEI, B, but it's important to maintain an understanding of the differences between these concepts, these precepts, and the principles, and why they matter and how they can help us achieve the outcomes that we are pursuing. Okay, so just grounding that. Now I'm going to pivot to talking about the legal parameters around what can be done for remedying, addressing, or otherwise dealing with racial inequality and racial inequity. So in California, there are a number of legal parameters that constrain what can be done in terms of race consciousness and policy or program design. The first is colloquially known as Proposition 209, but formally known as Article 1, Section 31 of the California Constitution. This is a 1990s ballot initiative that has been adopted into law by the voters of California. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the provisions of this proposition in a minute. The second is the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution. The third is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which governs the use of federal funds. Then there's also Title VII, which governs employment, Title VIII, which covers housing, and then Section 1981, which covers contracts and grants, although there is variation in federal law around Section 1981. I'm happy to answer questions about these parameters. In general, however, and to simplify somewhat, because we don't have much time, federal law prohibits 2 practices. It prohibits the use of race as a motivating factor for discriminatory purposes. So policymakers or any government official, even school administrators or university administrators, are not allowed to discriminate on the basis of race in contexts in which race is a motivating factor. This is Arlington Heights, series of 1970s cases interpreting the Equal Protection Clause. And then there's a parallel jurisprudence for Title VI and Title VII. The second general prohibition, however, is the use of racial classifications. So even if there isn't a discriminatory intent, any use of race as and this is really, I want to be clear about this, as a selection or decision criterion, as a factor for a selection or decision criterion at the individual level is presumptively prohibited. So you're allowed to actually consider race. You just can't do it at the individual level as a selection or decision criterion. So what does this mean? As a decision criterion, I mean as a hiring decision, as a contracting decision, as a promotion decision or firing decision. You're allowed to consider race, pardon me. You're just not allowed to do it at the individual level as a selection or decision criterion. And we can get into what that means. Also prohibited, although not under the Equal Protection Clause, but under Title VII and Title VIII, are disparate impacts, which are also known as discriminatory effects. Now, I want to be really clear. Statistical evidence of a disparate impact is insufficient alone by itself to establish a disparate impact. There has to be a strong causal connection combined with statistically significant disparate impacts. And it's a little bit tricky with respect to Title VI because there's no private right of action under Title VI, but in general, the law does prohibit disparate impacts by race. But again, in certain contexts, what's called discriminatory effects statutorily. Okay, so there's a lot there, so I'm happy to answer any questions about that. But let me just briefly go over Prop 209. Prop 209 is a widely recognized but broadly misunderstood provision. And part of the reason it's misunderstood is because many policymakers in California think that Prop 209 is just an absolute bar to race consciousness or racial equity. In fact, it is far from that. So this is Section A of Prop 209. I just want to highlight and emphasize that it only covers 3 areas. It only covers public employment, public education, and public contracting. It does not cover housing, does not cover public health, it does not cover transportation and infrastructure. It is not a bar in these areas. Also note public. Now, many of the areas I just mentioned, like housing, it might cover because you can imagine public contracting being a means, for transit, infrastructure, or housing, or public employment in public health processes. But I just want to emphasize that there is a lot that it does not extend itself to. I'm happy to clarify any contours of this, but I just wanted to note that there's a lot that Prop 209 does not cover. It is pretty comprehensive, though, in that what it means by public is pretty much any iteration of a public entity you could imagine. And Section F, it's only text of Prop 209 is only 1 page, but I provided several paragraphs here for you to see. Okay. In general, I just want to emphasize that race consciousness, that is to say, policies or programming that is designed with either an awareness of race, an awareness of the effects of race, or a racial motivation is actually broadly permitted under law. What is prohibited is what the justices and the Supreme Court and other courts call race-based policies. So race-based is the vernacular for policies that use race as a factor as a selection criterion. But race consciousness is actually broadly permitted. My little simple Venn diagram here sort of shows all race-based policies are race conscious, but the vast majority of race conscious policies are not actually race-based. And then we can get into that later, but it's really important to keep in mind that distinction. And there are, many, many, many race conscious policies that pursue race as a goal, racial equity as a goal, but they are not race-based and they are broadly permitted. And I'm going to talk about what those are in a bit. Just if you'd like to dive a little bit deeper into this, we have a legal guidance on our website of the Othering and Belonging Institute. It's called Advancing Racial Equity, Legal Guidance for Advocates. We posted this shortly after the Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard case and the UNC case. And we actually just published an FAQ that gets into some of the nitty-gritty about things that are happening in the federal government right now, which I'm not going to get into. But it has 13 frequently asked questions that dive into a little bit of this in more detail and with a little bit more precision than I have time to get into today. Okay, I'm going to move to the third part of the presentation, which is design principles for remedying racial inequality. Again, this is both narrative and this is also in terms of design of policy and program. One of the most important things that is evident in the literature is to find ways to pursue policies and programs that are both in fact or perceived to be positive sum rather than zero sum. There is a rich literature on this. One of the more recent popular books by Heather McGee called The Sum of Us really gets into this. But one of the most serious impediments to public support for racial equity and racial justice policies is that some programs and policies are either perceived to be or framed as zero sum. The reality is that very few things are actually zero sum. There are some things that are zero sum. Admissions can be zero sum if institutions are constrained in terms of expanding admissions. Class rank can be zero sum, but most things that pertain to race are not actually zero sum. I'll give you some examples of things, of policies here at the bottom that are aimed at racial inequality, but actually serve a larger body of people. Probably the most important recent example is bail reform. If you go and look at racial justice policy platforms from almost any organization in the last 5 years, bail reform, that is pretrial detention in criminal justice systems, is usually at or near the top of the list of reforms. Importantly, bail reform, those reforms or those proposals around bail reform are almost never race specific. That is to say, the reform doesn't say that municipalities or states or other jurisdictions should modify their pretrial detention policies in a race specific way or only for African Americans or Hispanics or whatever the case may be. Rather, it suggests that bail reform needs a larger look. And so you have bail reform process, reforms in places like New York City, Minneapolis, and elsewhere, although many of those have since been rolled back. Another very famous example is the poll tax amendment, the amendment to the Constitution that prohibits poll taxes. It was widely understood that the poll tax disproportionately, both targeted and disproportionately affected Black Southerners. Yet, in framing the poll tax amendment, that amendment was not framed just to prohibit the use of poll taxes on Black voters or Black primary voters. Rather, it was a blanket prohibition, universal prohibition on poll taxes. So the point here is that it doesn't matter what the proposal is, whether it's baby bonds or voting rights, even affirmative action, which many people think is the quintessential race-specific policy, has actually, many people know, helped white women entry into institutions from which they were underrepresented or excluded. So many policies, again, that are aimed at racial inequality or racial inequity can be designed in a positive sum way. And in fact, even those that are viewed or perceived as zero sum, in many cases are positive sum. But the principle here is for the commissioners, in the design of policies or in the design of guidance or programs, just bear in mind the importance of emphasizing positive sum. It doesn't mean that every single one has to be strictly positive sum, but it does make it far more likely that whatever program or policy you're advancing will be sustained, less likely to be undermined, engender resentment or backlash. And again, part of this is not just what are we doing today, but can it be sustained over the long term? So key principle is positive sum, not zero sum. Second principle is to try and draw your attention to systems and structures. Much racial inequality today is produced by the interaction of institutions or institutional elements in larger structures. So tax-based capacity interacting with public goods and public provision, or such as provision of health or funding of public schools. And that interacts with home values and wealth and so forth. And so to the extent that the commission can provide guidance or develop principles that focuses attention on the operation of systems and structures rather than the search for individuals who may have racial animus or racial motivation, you are more likely to touch more people and produce systemic effects, particularly if you're looking at the interaction of institutions within larger systems. So in general, I would say orient your attention on policies and system elements rather than people or targeting them to people. And this is both normative and analytic. Again, if you understand the production of racial inequality to be not just interpersonal or even institutional, but systemic and structural, then you're likely to have system effects when you have systemic interventions. And then it's also normative because it produces, it's also it's analytic because it produces a better fit between the problem and the solution, but it's also normative because it means that in terms of being able to frame this as positive sum and also to avoid the view that this is intentionally discriminatory or motivated by discriminatory intent, it's more likely to be sustainable and survive legal challenges. There are a lot of problems with interventions that just focus on people, that are people specific and don't also affect structures. One of the problems with that, and I don't have time to get into too many of it, but one of the problems with that, with people specific interventions, is they tend to be either under or over inclusive. So if you just blanket people based on racial identity, you're possibly helping people who aren't the most disadvantaged, or you're not necessarily tailoring it to the most disadvantaged. You may also fail to reach people who are similarly affected by the structural arrangement. There's a complicated literature, for example, on affirmative action. Now that affirmative action is banned not just in California, but elsewhere. For example, there was a lot of research that showed that affirmative action as typically practiced, especially at selective institutions, typically reached people who were middle class, upper middle class, or upper class, even though it did produce high levels of racial diversity and far more effectively than any simple proxy. Class-based affirmative action, in contrast, particularly based on income, actually does not yield nearly the same racial diversity. So we've actually seen this. Last fall, there was a lot of research that came out that looked at the top 50, 60 institutions that had to abandon affirmative action in the wake of the SFFA decision. And in many of those institutions, in fact, I think it was 3/4 of those institutions, there was a reduction in the representation of Black and Hispanic students in the undergraduate schools and also in law schools and graduate schools. The problem is that I don't want to get too in the weeds here. So if you're just using income, you're can boost the representation of low income and economically disadvantaged, but doesn't necessarily yield race. But if you're just using race, you may actually have very little effect or modest effect on producing undergraduate bodies that are diverse by income. So if you're looking at structural arrangements and you look, for example, at concentrated poverty or poverty at the school level, combined with race consciousness, you can actually get at structural disadvantage in a much more tailored way. So there are ways to get at structural disadvantage by combining multiple factors in ways that are actually much more tailored to the structural position than just looking at individuals in particularly. Also, again, by targeting structures, policies and programs have a larger set of beneficiaries and therefore tend to have stronger support. And part of this is just about how can you do this in a sustainable way. It's not enough to adopt a program or a policy if it's unwound within 2 to 4 to 5 years, right? Sustainability is really the key. And by targeting structures, you not only have a more effective or salutary policy, but you're more likely to have a sustainable policy, one that is less likely to be challenged in court, one that is less likely to be reversed by subsequent policymakers. This gets to something I was already mentioning, which is that it's actually fine to use correlates, proxies, or multiple factors. The term proxy is a little bit tricky because you're not allowed to use proxy as a cover or a fig leaf for a race factor, but you are allowed to use proxies that are honestly considered and consistently applied in their own terms. So if you are looking at factors such as neighborhood poverty, educational attainment, formerly incarcerated status, single parent households, or the density of single parent households in design of policy or program, You are allowed to use these, and you're allowed to use them even with an awareness and, in fact, a specific intention that it promote racial equity or racial diversity, part of race consciousness. What you're not allowed to do is say you're using these, but actually evaluating applicants or, you know, in employment or admissions contexts when you're actually looking at race instead. And the more of these correlates that you use, the tighter the connection you can get between racial disadvantage and the policy design and also the structural disadvantage. So this is actually broadly permitted. Again, the key, it's a little bit tricky because the term proxy is a little bit ambiguous. You can use proxy as a factor that helps you get at racial goals, but you cannot use proxy as a fig leaf to cover your actual consideration of race. I hope that makes sense. So there's a lot of nuance here. It's a nuanced point, but it's a really, really important, critical legal distinction. Now, racial disparities are actually really important. We need to track racial disparities. We need to understand racial disparities. And generally, we use them as a diagnostic to help us see where there is structural disadvantage and also analytically to help us understand the dynamics of what's happening. But it's also dangerous to overemphasize them for a number of reasons. One is that just in terms of framing problems to the general public, when learning of racial disparities or when centering racial disparities, it can actually undermine support for racial equity interventions because some people, some sectors and segments of the public, unless carefully framed and explained why the disparity exists, will revert to, you know, the colorblind racism frame, the cultural racism frame, any of the frames that Benia Silvitz or talks about or other researchers have foregrounded. So, so it's fine to note disparities. I would just be careful. Again, I'm not saying don't emphasize them, but be careful in how you emphasize them or frame them. This is a narrative point. Instead, I think the way to thread the needle here is to note the disparity, but emphasize the unfairness or injustice of the problem as a broader matter, and then try and explain how the racial equity policy or program will not only reduce the disparity, but produce broader benefits. So again, going back to the poll tax or bail reform, right? There's a disparity in terms of who is able to vote prior to the Voting Rights Act and the poll tax amendment. But the abolition of poll taxes produced a broader benefit, even though it disproportionately helped Black voters in the South. Same with bail reform. Bail reform may have disproportionate racial effects, but bail reform as a policy produces broader and more salutary criminal justice effects within the broader criminal justice system. And you can apply that to any reform, educational interventions, health interventions, housing interventions. Again, interventions, they may have disparate racial effects, but a sustainable structural intervention is going to produce broader effects. Just doing a time check. I think I'm good on time. Okay. Also consider targeted universalism or targeted universal design. This is a complex policy and program design process that basically establishes universal goals for any problem, and it brings people together to help set the universal goal. And then it yields multiple implementation strategies for different groups, communities, and combinations thereof. It rejects a one-size-fits-all, either in means or goals, to help people reach the universal goal. And it recognizes that this is just a reality. Different social groups, different communities have different needs, capacities, and disabling constraints. And so targeted universalism formalizes that recognition and helps develop a process that can actually create interventions that meet those needs. So you might have a universal goal in which you have multiple disparities across dimensions of social identity. And you might actually need 5 interventions to help 10 groups reach that goal. And the different combinations of those interventions are tailored to different groups. So people with disability, people who are Hispanic, people who are African American, people who are Asian, they may have different needs based upon their cultural location, their socio-political location. And so targeted universalism helps us figure out what the needs are for each of those groups and then helps us develop the interventions that can assist those groups in reaching or getting closer to the universal goal. There's a separate memo that I think Dr. Estes has provided to you that goes through the targeted universalism design process. I don't have time to do all that today, but I'm happy to answer any questions about that. And then this is another highly nuanced point. Process in a review of structural and racial equity policies and programs, or DEI policies and programs, there's a tendency to revert to what I denote as process-based remedies. I don't think that you should entirely avoid these. I think they can be important in many contexts, but I would limit them. And so we have a tool on our website called the Structural Racism Remedies Repository. This is a resource of over 1,000 policy recommendations from nearly 100 resources. Excuse me. 100 resources, including white papers, including books, including policy platforms from the Movement for Black Lives Matter to the Kerner Commission to, you name it. And what a review of this repository shows is there's a tendency when it gets hard or difficult to design or implement substantive policies to revert to process-based remedies. And again, process-based are trainings, forums, data dashboards, professional development. In the corporate DEI context, this becomes particularly popular because for two reasons. One is that there's a concern that maybe the leadership, the C-suite, is not really supportive of the harder equity policies. And so there's a tendency, well, we need to do something, but we're not sure if we can actually do what we can do. So there's a reversion to process-based remedies. And process-based remedies give you a sense of activity. They can even give you a sense of effort and accomplishment, but they're far less likely to produce tangible outcomes, either structural interventions, structural reforms, or reduction in disparities by themselves. Again, I'm not saying that these are unimportant. In fact, collecting data, data dashboards, they can be very important. But I would avoid over-reliance on these process-based remedies. I would limit them and make sure that that much of what you're offering in terms of guidance or principles or program is really based in substance rather than just process. Again, they can provide, and one of the dangers is they can provide the impression of effort, often with far less effectiveness. There's a lot of research on diversity trainings that shows that some forms of diversity trainings are not only ineffective, they can actually be counterproductive. And I can direct you to that research. It's really important to develop effective interventions, because if you design an ineffective intervention, it will engender cynicism, and people they'll give up. They'll feel like, well, we tried that and it didn't work. So it's actually in some ways more harmful to do something that's counterproductive or ineffective than to not do anything at all. And here's the resource I mentioned earlier. There's over 1,000 policy recommendations in 13 different issue areas. You can just Google this if you'd like to peruse it. It's a searchable repository. I actually think I'm going to stop there and open up for comment. I think I'm at time anyway, so I think I'm actually maybe a couple minutes over. But thank you so much, commissioners and the audience, for giving me time to share these principles with you.
Thank you, Stephen. What I'd like to do is before opening up to public comment, offer an opportunity to Commissioner Richardson for any questions or comments or thoughts. I'll add something as well.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you for that great presentation. Very interesting. We talked about some things we've talked about before, but always an opportunity to learn something new. I want to ask a real technical, tactical question, which is not normally my approach, but thinking about as we get closer and thinking about the framework and implementation. So really helpful around the positive sum and zero sum conversation. That was very helpful, and how important that can be in avoiding undermining the efforts that one might make in terms of implementing equity programs. So one of the things that happens both in public and corporate service is you hear a lot as if we promote diversity, then we're not focusing on merit. That's always a comment. And when I saw you talking about avoiding or limiting process-based remedies, what everybody thinks they're going to do is let's all get in a room and train people not to think that way, or let's have some forum where we talk about that's not allowed. What would you recommend as a effective approach to address that common sentiment, both in public and corporate work?
Yeah, it's difficult. There are a number of ways to respond to the complaint, that diversity is undermining merit. One is that, there's a really rich body of research that shows that, and this goes to Scott Page's book, The Difference. There are a number of other research studies that show that diverse teams, diverse environments just produce better outcomes, whether it's in the corporate sector, whether it's in the classroom. The capacity to exchange diverse viewpoints, avoid groupthink, um, of within corporate cultures or public institutions, it's vital to have diverse backgrounds and diverse perspectives. And so instead of being in tension with merit, it actually produces and yields better outcomes. There's a reason. It's not just about a sense of affiliation or connection or belonging, although that's part of it. It's actually about the mechanics of grappling with contrasting perspectives, right? I mean, you so I would probably point them to that research. I would point them to them to show how, in the corporate context, diverse teams produce better outcomes, how diverse perspectives in the educational context produce more vibrant classroom discussions, and so forth. The other thing I would say is that, well, so that's one way. That's one way to frame. The other way to say is, like, what is merit? So you can actually challenge the concept of merit itself. Is merit just raw intelligence, or is it something else? And this is, Bowen and Box, The Shape of the River, which found that students who had benefited, or beneficiaries of affirmative action, were actually more likely to give back and serve their communities. So one way to reconceptualize merit, or as Amartya Sen defines it, merit is a system to reward that which society has reason to value, right? And so what is it we value? What is the, is it just raw intelligence? Because we know that just, raw intelligence is not what yields Nobel Prize winners. It's not just pure intelligence as traditionally measured. There are other components to it. And so in any context, whether it's admissions context or a hiring context or contracting, whatever it is, there are a variety of factors you want to look at. And we have a tendency to just think, especially in the university context, that the only thing that matters is grade point average and SAT scores. But we know that SAT scores are highly correlated with grandparent wealth and family income. And there's a reason that you want to look. I mean, there's a number of different ways you can do this. One thing you can do is you can look for strivers. They may not have the highest SAT scores, but if a student is dramatically overperforming in their context based upon their disadvantage, that student is far more likely to have grit, determination, the ability to overcome, than students who may be, a 1400 SAT student that comes from a very wealthy context, right? So there's a lot to it. I would probably do both those things. I would challenge what we mean by merit, and I would also point out the research that shows that diverse teams, diverse institutions just perform better. And I think that this notion that merit and diversity are in tension, some of that just comes frankly from racist assumptions that, and I don't necessarily think we should just call people who say that racist, but I do think it's a fallacy to assume that those things are in tension.
Thank you so much for that answer, and just to remind us to look broader in those opportunities. And thank you, Dr. Pastor, for giving me the opportunity to ask a question. That concludes my question.
Certainly. So let me ask two questions. Both of them are somewhat unfair, but I think I can do that to you, Stephen. It's fine. So I'm wondering if you've given any thought to the fires in Los Angeles, which in Altadena had very racially disparate impacts, because in Altadena, the home ownership rate for black folks was twice the national average, was about 80%. And so whatever we do to actually rebuild that area, which actually has interesting differences but ties in a way to Pacific Palisades much richer, we are protecting an important sense of, or an important moment of Black generational wealth that I think is really crucial. So I'm wondering if you've thought a little bit about the language around that we need to put forward so that racial equity becomes part of that recovery kind of program, and that we take advantage of the lessons that you're lifting up. Second question is, what is your experience with getting people who are in state agencies to move in this direction? Because some of this can seem like just one more pain in the ass kind of thing for someone who's got a full-time job already to take into account. And I think what Commissioner Richardson was saying was crucial, which is people don't want this just to become trainings.
Yeah.
They want it to be something substantive, so they want a tool they can take away. So first question is about narrative around things like the fires. Second is a question around how to motivate our public agency partners to say, oh, this is doable and it makes sense, and here's what I can do.
So I'll take the second question first. So I've worked with a number of state agencies, mostly housing agencies of late, on policies that have racial equity components. And I think your concern is spot on, that what you want to avoid is a sense that this is just another burden, another responsibility, another duty that you have to just go through the motions. What we really want is outcomes. And if we're going to persuade and get buy-in from state agencies or any government actor, it could be county commissioners, it could be city council members, again, other institutional leaders, you're going to have to show them why this matters and how it's going to benefit and serve their communities and their constituents. And so if you think about any of these kinds of reforms we talked about, it could be zoning reform, it could be bail reform, it could be the delivery of health services, whatever it is. As long as the policy is both reducing racial disparities and serving the broader public and producing just better and healthier outcomes, I think you can get buy-in, but you have to make the case for that. You have to show them how those effects will materialize and why it's important to work on that. And it could be, again, increasing home ownership rates. I did a presentation for a joint committee for the state legislature a couple of years ago on home ownership rates in California. And Black home ownership just lags the rest of both the state average, which is very low compared to the national average. But there's some paradoxes in there. So I've actually just recently completed analysis of tenure in the state, and actually Black tenure is about a year and a half. It's about 16 years. The average tenure of homeowner for African Americans in the state is about 16 years, which is about 2.5 years longer than Asian tenure. So what it means is that you have this older generations who own their homes, but the younger generations don't. So there's a lot of paradoxes when it comes to that. But the point here is that in advising state agencies or state leaders, it's really important to make the case for how this is not just a layer of responsibility, but why this is going to really help Californians and help the communities in California by showing what the harmful problem is and how the policies and interventions can help address this harm. And then again, what the race-specific harm is, and then how these harms affect more Californians than just racial identities. And so I think if you can do those two things, you can get buy-in, and it'll also be sustainable. To answer the first question, there has been a pattern with all these so-called natural disasters, going back to Hurricane Katrina and before Hurricane Sandy in New Jersey, that in general, these events produce racially disparate effects. And they're often very specific to the episode. So in the context of Katrina, right, it was who owns a car, the evacuation plan, then the lower ninth ward being disproportionately located in the floodplain. But in general, we see that more widely, that racially marginalized populations tend to be more vulnerable to these natural disasters. Again, whether it's hurricanes or fires or flooding. And part of the way that I think we have to deal with that is with a structural perspective. What are the structural vulnerabilities and structural disadvantages that particularly racialized communities experience? Identify them, recognize them, and then develop policies to try and address, ameliorate, or respond to them. So, absolutely. It's not just right. It's not just the loss of wealth. Again, I just mentioned that Black homeownership in this state lags far behind. It's in 30 percentages. What every episode like this harms those long-term, long-tenured homeowners. How can we create sustainable home ownership in a more equitable way in California is one of the biggest challenges the state faces. And in terms of the policy response, in some ways it could be made more difficult, right? So if the state just operationalizes a lot of policies, that's going to cause home insurance to skyrocket. It's going to cause, which already is happening, it's going to put more rules and regulations in terms of rebuilding. It's going to advantage the wealthy or people who are in communities that are less vulnerable. So we have to do this in a more equitable way. It's not simple, but the way that we do that is by identifying the structural relationships, the potential for disparate impact, and then designing policies that are sensitive to both of those things.
Thank you, Stephen. We'll open up to public comment now. Before we do, one thing which I think really gets at this question of subtle policy issues. In the county of Los Angeles, about 7% of the properties have listed as their last time that they changed hands, 1975, which means 1975 or before Prop 13. But in Altadena, that figure is not 7%, but 15%.
Wow.
Some of it is long-term Black homeowners that you referred to. Some of it is the passage of properties to children, but to cousins and others without officially re-registering with the state. So as people now go to get disaster assistance, they're coming into the reality that they may owe back taxes, that they're not straight with the law on this. And you could certainly imagine, unless you take an approach to this problem which solves it, you're going to have racially disparate impacts on the recovery. So I think it really gets at this question of what is a subtle policy you don't even think of that actually is something that can either promote or deter racial equity. With that, let me open it up and see if there's public comment. Augustine?
We have one virtual public comment and 2 in-person public comments. We will go ahead and get started with in-person public comments, and then we will go ahead and do virtual public comments. As I call your name, please line up by the podium. Our first in-person public comment is going to be William Cooper, and our second in-person is going to be Malik Glasgow.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me here. I'm William Cooper. I'm the Executive Director at the Becoming Project located in Calipatria, California. That was a lot of information, Stephen. Thank you for your presentation. After last night, I was so encouraged about these meetings and the energy that was inside the room. Hearing this presentation is giving it a different picture for me. I like to first start off with saying, before we tackle racial equity, we have to tackle equity. That is the root cause of this. Before you consider any individual race, it's just equity. If you look up the definition, it's going to say fair and impartial or fairness of treatment. It's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about wanting for your brother and sister what you want for yourself. That's equity. It covers everything. If you want a livable wage, you want the person across the street to have a livable wage. If you want to be able to gather with your friends that celebrate the same things or look like you without being harassed, then the person across the street wants to be able to gather with friends that look like them and hold similar values without being harassed. That's equity. Once you get equity, then the race of it doesn't matter. I think we all would have benefited more in American history by teaching tolerance more than anything else. Hearing all of the information, I went from optimistic to upset because I see what the problem is with the system. All the nuances and the technical terms for things that are horrible and should be called horrible are what keeps us back. I've never once seen a moderate but effective racial equity ship in America. I don't know a moderate way to explain the conditions of Imperial County. We have the extremes of everything. If I don't explain it to you as an extreme, you might not see it as what it is. The clarity of thought, when you use words like proxy, if it's a tricky word for you, it's a tricky word for the opposition. They always hang you up for it. Get rid of things like that, 'cause it's unnecessary. You want to always be clear when you're presenting the terms and the ultimate goal. I heard Stephen say that history has proven that companies or organizations that have diversity and inclusion has did better. That's your argument. It's the only argument you need. It's not a merit thing. Look at your end goal and look what history has proven you. Look at where you're at now. I guarantee you that we're better off today than we were 30 years ago. Whether or not people are satisfied with that might have changed in the recent tense, but it doesn't change the fact that we're in a better situation, but worse circumstances. I see that my time is. I see that my time is up.
Yeah.
I just want all of us to reconsider the way that we frame this conversation. It's very good for legal arguments, but it doesn't do much for us day to day. It doesn't do much to get me home, and I'm afraid to be pulled over by a police officer because I'm black. It doesn't do much to argue with my landlord if he's trying to kick me out because I'm behind on the rent. You need to, some instances, it has to be direct. It has to be a direct result. The wide-eye view doesn't always work inside small communities like this. I'll close right there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next comment.
Thank you very much. My name is Malik Glasgow. I'm an activist artist, secretary at Access to Thrive. First off, thank you guys for your time and for all the information. Like William said, yesterday I was very optimistic. Today I'm slightly less optimistic, but a lot more informed. My question was simple. I just want to know if we could get anything that you guys present, any of these slides, if they could be maybe presented to us, because it is a lot of information. It's very technical. So if we can go back and review this and, like you said, make it more on the ground. Because right now it is a very conceptual. There's a lot of very nuanced things. So we want to make them applicable to our day-to-day lives. So if we could just get these slides potentially from anybody who's going to present today. I know we all left our emails there. So if that'd be a possibility, that'd be awesome. And thank you very much again for your time and all the information that you guys are sharing with us.
Thank you. We will make all slides and resources shared today available on our website, and it usually takes about 10 to 14 business days for that to happen, but we will get stuff on our public website.
I believe we have one online comment.
Yes, we have one virtual public comment. For the virtual public commenter, when you hear your name, please raise your hand. Alejandra Ponce de Leon. You may begin your public comment when you're ready.
Hi, can you hear me?
Loud and
Yes.
clear.
Hi,
Yes.
good morning. Alejandra Ponce de Leon with Catalyst California. Just appreciate, Stephen, your presentation. I think there's a lot of things to take away from it and a lot of things to process. And I had a question, both for you and for the members of the committee in terms of those substantive changes. What are those kinds of reforms that really make a difference and have an impact? For you, Stephen, I was curious of what are examples, thinking about the work that that this commission will do at the state level within state government, government. There's a lot of things that they could include within the framework, but what would be those substantive changes that you would, give us examples for us to think about and to consider? And then also, for Dr. Pastor and Dr. Yolanda Richardson, have you had any thoughts about like substantive changes that you've been kind of pondering about or thinking about? So just wanted to put it out there as a question to continue this conversation and really dive into what could those substantive changes be that allow us to see the impact that we want to see in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you. We have one more online public comment. Commissioner Pastor, this is a public comment for, it looks like for item number 2, which we already passed.
No, it's for this one. I apologize.
Okay. Brandon,
Yeah.
Brandon, you may go ahead and go.
Hi, Brandon Green, Western Center on Law and Poverty. I want to thank the presenter for all of the information. In particular, I also want to thank Commissioner Pastor about the question as it relates to Altadena. I've been curious how the commission in its work might be able to give some recommendations to the legislature, especially as there's all these emergency regulations being passed as to the rebuilding of places. And there's already discussion about how some of those might look like not rebuilding single family homes in Altadena and instead building high density homes, which would just result in a disappearance of a community. But I also wanted to sort of highlight what the other commenters said, which is as somebody who does this work every day across various spaces, I think all of the information is extremely important, and I'm happy that it was noted that there is a lot of sort of voluntary over compliance with like Prop 209 and other things. But I think my urgence in this particular social political moment is that as we're having all the conversations about all of the nuance, entire administrative systems are under threat and attack. And thus far, we've not heard much from California, either the legislature or the Attorney General's office, about how California intends to stand up in this moment. And so I appreciate all the education, but there's a real necessity to get a tool to state agencies as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Pastor, we received one more in-person public comment.
Yes, please.
Will Daniela Flores please line up behind the podium, and you can begin your public comment when you're ready.
Thank you. Daniela Flores from Fair Valley Equity and Justice. And thank you so much for this.
I believe the virtual feed audio was muted, the presenter feed. Can you go ahead and check that, please? Commissioner Richardson, it looks like their feed is the one that cut off, right? Okay. So thank you all while they try and get us back on.
on the building.
Um, it looks like we're back. Should I go ahead and answer the questions or wait?
Think we are still, I think there might be a minor break. Trying to get
Oh,
confirmation, but yeah.
well, because okay. Did the recess happen? Oh,
I'm trying to get confirmation, Steven. Let's see if I can
okay.
get,
Okay, because
yeah.
I have a presentation at 11, so that's why I have
Thank you.
to.
I will
Yeah.
make sure to let them know. Thank you.
Augustine, I missed that. Are they on break?
Yes, it looks like we're on a brief recess. I'm trying to see when we're coming back.
So I'll put this in the chat, but just to share what I was going to say in response to the question for an example of policy. One example of policy, like a specific substantive policy, would be reforms around use of force for police officers. That can be done at the municipal level or generally at the state level, but that's an example of a policy that has a tangible racial impact. Um, that like bail reform and pretrial detention, I think the commission could easily create a set of recommendations to different levels of government, and then also best practices that advance racial equity. And if it created a toolkit like that, then different entities, whether it's the state legislature or state agencies or county government, could decide which to pick up, which is appropriate for its context. And that could be a very, very valuable set of tools. Anyway, if you need me to say that on the record later, before 11, I'm happy to do that as well.
I would just say, Stephen, I think that'd be very helpful, especially the part about having instructions for different levels, because I don't think in all the meetings I've been at, I've ever heard that as a recommendation. I think that'd be very important. So if we don't get our audio back, I don't know if maybe that can be submitted later or in the comments, but that would definitely be great for the record for us as commissioners. I'll speak for Commissioner Pastor on that one.
So not sure if you just saw the message, but it looks like they are experiencing an internet outage at their location. So they're logging onto a mobile hotspot to temporarily reconnect. So they're taking a break, and we'll be coming back at 10:53. I've also let them know, Stephen, that you have to log off at 11 for another presentation.
Thanks, Oxton. Thank you. I know it's hard to all this coordination, but you do a magnificent job. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Commissioner.
I'm gonna restart my computer, but I'll still be here on the phone.
Sounds good. Thank you. Steven, I just got word that it looks like we won't be coming back at 10:53. So probably coming back closer to 11:04. I did let them know though that you have to uh, attend another presentation. So I do apologize for that. And I'll make sure that they reach out to you if they have any additional questions.
Okay, no, thank you. I appreciate that. It's okay. I'll try and give some written feedback based upon what Commissioner Richardson said. Um, I don't know yeah, if there's an opportunity to formally do that, let me know how to do that and I'll do that. But I do have to jump into another meeting. I have a presentation at 11. So, and they want me to jump in now. So thank
Sounds
you.
good. Thank you.
Sorry that there's been technical problems, but and just want to say, like, I heard what the commenter said, Commissioner, it's hard. I mean,
Yep.
creating sustainable, legal program and guidance is not easy. And I feel the
Mhm.
need, like that they want something that tangibly touches their lives. And I get that.
Exactly.
I do too. But there is an inherent sophistication to this, to doing it right and effectively and sustainability that's
Right.
unavoidable. It's just unavoidable,
Yep.
and it's like, as much as I wish we could just, get this thing,
Mhm.
let's just, so however you want to, if you have any questions about any things that I talked about today or want further elaboration, I'll try and make that point about, a set of recommendations tailored to different levels of government or agencies. I think it's really important because,
Okay.
yeah, the state legislature is just a different entity than county and municipal government, and getting best practice to each of those can be really, best practices and recommendations to each of those is really important if we're going to have an effective racial equity policy in the state. So
Thank you so much. Very obviously a very effective presentation today. Got everybody thinking and feeling. So very, very helpful.
I appreciate that. Not necessarily feeling the way that we wanted them to, but at least grappling with it. So thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Joyce, if you can come on up. Folks, we're going to get started with the second part. We recognize that Wi-Fi is temperamental right now, but we do want to move through our meeting. Commissioner Richardson does have a hard stop at 11:15, so we are doing our best to get through this agenda. We apologize for the inconvenience and the issues with Wi-Fi. I believe we wrapped up public comment.
Yes.
So if you can take us to the next agenda item, we'll go from there.
Great. It's wonderful to be back with you and to realize that the most advanced, technologically capable state in the world can't quite keep Wi-Fi going. It's great. So calling the meeting back to order. The agenda item 5 is a discussion facilitated by Joyce Chow, who is our facilitator from Abundance. She'll guide us through a discussion on key activities from recent meetings, what we've heard, what we want to explore further to continue to move to the creation of the Commission's racial equity framework. And Commissioner Richardson, I just want to be clear that before you leave at 11:15, we'll make sure, even if Joyce is not quite done, that you have a chance to step in and make any final comments before your hard stop. Joyce.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Pastor. So today, the purpose of this conversation is, just as Commissioner Pastor was saying, we've been in these series of conversations and hearing some things as well about like, what does this mean? How does this translate into this racial equity framework that the Commission is developing for the state of California? And I want to start by grounding us in this timeline very quickly. In February, we had the Budget Equity Committee and the Data Committee begin meeting to start building out their 3 to 5 initial recommendations on tools and methodologies, right, to advise for state agencies. Today, this is the opportunity for the Framework Development Committee to begin thinking through, okay, what does this mean for the framework as a whole, the structure and the content? And then this afternoon, we'll continue that discussion with the Community Engagement Committee and the full Commission. So all that to say, what we're really building towards over the course of this year, but at least through June, is starting to flesh out the frame of this framework, if I can say that, thinking through the outline and then continuing to build with increasing content from there. Okay, so these conversations are really teeing us up for the next few months. With that said, I know sometimes I say that and folks feel like, wow, this conversation feels really final. This is a starting point. I know, Commissioner Richardson, you've been in the other committees, you've kind of seen this process play out now. There is a little bit of flexibility in this conversation, but we do want to start narrowing in so that we can get to June with an annotated outline. And so if we can go to the next slide here, we've taken a look at the timeline, and what we have up is a slide from our December 19th Commission meeting, where we took a look at initial findings from the asset analysis. I know the Commission will talk about this more this afternoon, but the question presented on this slide was, how can the racial equity framework best support your organization's equity work, right? And as this Framework Development Committee starts to think about what this framework continues to look like, I think it's helpful to ground us back in what we heard in the asset analysis. So there's a lot of text on this slide. For folks who are seeing this for the first time in the room or online, this will be posted online again afterwards. But the point here that I want to make is what we're seeing is, a lot of the question of, okay, yes, but how? How do we do this, right? We know that the racial equity framework, or our racial equity strategies, us being the organizations that submitted their responses here, we know it has to move into action. It can't just live on a page, but how do we do that, right? We know that measuring our outcomes, our progress, even if it's a bit process based, we know that it still has a place in our equity work. So how do we do that? So just want to put that kind of tidbit in the Commission's mind, in the committee's mind as we go into the conversations. All right. So really the majority of this time, I want to open it up to Commissioner Pastor and Commissioner Richardson. This is the outline that the Commission started to discuss on December 19th. We've got the overview, some introduction. We have sections for each of the core components of the framework, next steps, and then something in between that might be optional, if there's anything else the committee wants to add. And so the question that I'll pose to both Commissioner Pastor and Commissioner Richardson is, if we were to build upon the conversation we had in December, as we think about the conversations we had today and the asset analysis refresher, what does that framework really need to incorporate in structure? So the sections we're looking at here, but also in content, if there's any particular things you want to pull out for each of those sections to make sure that this framework is adopted and sustained, right? So that it keeps going. How should the tools and methodologies really be presented to agencies? And so we'll start with that, and then we might have a follow-up conversation after, but I'll open it up. Any initial thoughts there?
Commissioner Richardson, why don't we begin with you?
Okay. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Commissioner Pastor. Our conversation that we had today, I think what was helpful for me to think about as we think about the outline is the various audiences that will use this information. And while we want, and I appreciate, because I'm anxious to have this and have this tools that we can use, there's also going to be some of the structural things that we'll have to contain, some of the legal outlines or references to certain systems and structures that are already in place to ensure that the information or the outline can be understood in the context of how we all are operating today. And so sometimes that feels like, well, that's just not going to be at the level that I need it to be. It's not going to address what I'm doing today. But I think there's going to have to be a balance between both. One, so that it's useful, and two, that the implementation isn't so arduous that people are trying to figure out, now, how is this going to relate to, Prop 209 or all of the things that Stephen just talked about, which I'm sure was pretty intense, but necessary for us to remember that this is going to fit into a system that we want it to be useful right away. So hopefully I explained myself well, but I just think that's the balance. So I think just using that as a check as we go through this, just to make sure that it both is useful, but also able to be used in the context of what we're doing today.
So what I'll add to that from my sense of the conversation today, which is new, and so I think what is coming into this meeting from December makes a lot of sense, but I would add less process, more outcomes. And even looking at a slide ago about different trainings and stuff, maybe it's more focused on outcomes than should be more focused on outcomes and processes. Second, more plain language. How close to lived experience to plain language that people use in their lives can we bring into this? Third, more focus on the all. That is, more focus on, if we do this, here's how most people benefit from a change. I was struck earlier, I think that a lot of people have in their experience, they may not know what diversity is, but they know someone whose skills, experience, and strength were overlooked. And how can we lift that up in this process? And then finally, I think for the proposed framework, and maybe it comes in elsewhere, but I think it might be important here too, is to have some examples of where equity take-up was rapid, meaning that state agencies went, oh yeah, we really like this, we're going to use this. Like, I'm not 100% sure this is the case, but my experience with Cal EPA is that the EnviroScreen actually had some pretty big take-up. And I think if we could think about what are the 3 or 4 racial equity tools that have had really quick take-up and sort of commitment around them, what would be those ones and what can we learn?
Dr. Pastor, what I'm thinking about from a practical standpoint of what you just said, which is so helpful, is it sounds like what would be useful is best practices and recommendations on things that we know that actually have worked, or looking at data. So those three things jumped out at me when you said that, which I think would be really helpful in how we put the framework into some context.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm hearing some things here around, just to quickly recap, and you all let me know if this is not accurate or the language that you would use, but starting with, understanding that like legalese can sometimes feel very difficult to wade through, and can sometimes also be a roadblock to organizations doing the work of feeling like, I don't know how to navigate this. And so putting in that guidance up front and helping organizations think through that a little bit more, maybe encouraging that push into action, is one thing. I also heard less process, more outcomes, especially given the conversation we had with Stephen this morning. Plain language and lived experience. Really appreciate that framing, Commissioner Pastor, of, people might not connect to the term of diversity, but we know somebody who's been passed over for different reasons. And so just really connecting it with clear maybe examples or distilling that language into something that folks like really can connect to. And then that piece around best practices and recommendations and pulling in what we can also learn from other agencies who have been seeing a lot of adoption really quickly. Okay, is there anything else there you all would add? Maybe a quick check here too as well in terms of structure. Like, does this still feel like the right outline for this committee?
Dr. Estes.
Thank you, Commissioner Pastor. I think part of this outline was really to just give us a place to start thinking about how this document is organized. I think in some of the conversation that we had this morning with Stephen Menendian, some of those concepts may be weaved into, say, framework, values, goals, the roadmap, which we'll discuss later this afternoon. In my head, sometimes from an academic perspective, you do a technical report, which gives a little bit more of the maybe more legalese versus the plain language that should be in a document, but just finding ways to make sure that people that are using this document have access to the information that they need in plain language, but also in a way that gives them access to the details that they're probably going to ask for or look for. Just again, creating that balance that Commissioner Richardson acknowledged. And I do know we're running short on time, that we have Commissioner Richardson with us, and so I do want to make sure that we create space for anything else that we want to ask the Commissioner while we still have her.
Okay, absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Estes. And I think what you're speaking to is the range of audiences who will be using this framework, right? And making sure we are tailoring it to the needs of different groups. I'm sorry, Commissioner Richardson, I saw you come off mute, so if you had anything else to add.
Not other than I appreciate it. I am so sorry with the challenges of what's happening on my side, but appreciate the opportunity to participate today. But really appreciate Dr. Estes' comment about this is the starting place. This is the structure for us to respond to as we continue to take in information, the commission's flexibility around making changes and tweaks. And I know Dr. Estes has been awesome about doing that. So I want to continue to do that, but really just appreciated the presenter today and how that impacted our thinking as we go forward, and the great effort and the work of the staff. So just wanted to acknowledge that as well.
Okay, thank you. I know we have 3 more minutes with Commissioner Richardson. I think we originally had another discussion planned, and we've sort of segued into it a little bit. So I'll just take us there and see if there's any other thoughts we want to capture here. But part of the question was, we've talked about structure, we've talked about content. If there's anything else around how this information should be presented, just wanted to make sure we are leaving some space for that. I've already heard some things around tailoring it to different audiences, making sure that we've got some examples or things that other agencies have already been working on. Is there anything else folks would add there?
Not for me. I think that captured my comments.
I'll just say that I'm starting to think now, what's our social media campaign and communication strategy, given the way that people now communicate and relatively short attention spans? How do we have a series of bumper sticker messages about racial equity? It's good for all of us.
Just to respond to that, Commissioner Pastor, the staff are exploring contracting opportunities with entities on just that. They're not only broadening our engagement to communities that may be historically left out of conversations like this, but also what is a strategy for rolling out the framework and making sure that we are bringing that type of thinking into this process over the next several months, because we want to make sure that we're able to align the bumper sticker message with what is in a more formal traditional document. So we are doing that type of thinking more publicly, but we are also exploring contracting opportunities with an entity on how do you build buy-in within state agencies and departments, and just the specific thinking you need to have. And this goes back to a comment that Commissioner Richardson made around how do you make sure that implementation isn't arduous and that it doesn't feel heavy when folks are already feeling the pain of their typical job duty descriptions, and how do you weave these tools and best practices in a way that makes sense for them, in the way that they can kind of move it along and incorporate it and build it into their work.
Yeah. Okay, thank you all. I will wrap
Yes,
us.
I just want to make sure that Commissioner Richardson is our next TikTok star, talking about this message.
I don't know about that, Commissioner Pastor.
All right, so it sounds like more to come, TikTok and all these other things. But one thing I'll just plug as we wrap up this conversation is, we'll continue this conversation some more during this afternoon's commission meeting as well. So maybe starting to think through what are the things we want to make sure we bring forward into that broader commission discussion this afternoon. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Commissioner Pastor.
That's great. Well, first, thanks a lot. I really appreciate that, Joyce. Before we call for a motion to approve the initial set of framework development recommendations that'll come forward to the full commission later today, we're going to open up for any public comments at this point. And I guess I'll turn to Augustine, if he's available, to let us know whether there's any online or in-person comments.
Yes, Commissioner Pastor, we have one in-person public commenter, Abigail Freshley. Step up to the podium, and when you're ready to go, you may begin your public comment.
Good morning. Thank you so much. This was a great presentation. Really enjoyed it. In the last month and a half, there's been a bit of a chilling effect on DEI initiatives across the country and in our state, not to say anything of racial equity, which is the charge of this commission, and appeasement to leaders who don't share the values of racial equity and justice, even at the highest levels of our government here in the state. So now it's more important than ever, from my point of view, to be bold and brave with the way that this commission comes forward with racial equity recommendations in this framework. I was so pleased to hear that the community meeting last night went really well. It would be a shame if this commission traveled the state and invited community members to come out and share their pain points and traumas and lived experiences to the extent that we create a framework that isn't able to be implemented well. And so to that point, myself as a representative of public health advocates and a member of the California Racial Equity Coalition, we really want to emphasize the importance of an Office of Racial Equity as part of the racial equity framework as an implementation goal. There's so many great goals and principles that have been uplifted in today's presentation and in meetings prior that require training, support. We can't expect a flawed or broken system to be able to take up these ideals and these recommendations without proper support. And we believe that it's extremely important for an Office of Racial Equity to be included as one of the implementation goals of this framework. Thank you so much.
Remarkable. Done with 3 seconds left over. That was eloquent and efficient. Augustine, are there any other public comments?
Yes, Commissioner, we just received one more. Ashley Contreras, when you are ready, you may begin your public comment.
Ashley is back there.
Hi, thank you. My name is Ashley Contreras, and I'm the Executive Director of Access to Thrive. And my comment is about what you mentioned about social media. I understand that we're trying to reach the hard-to-reach communities and bringing those informations to them. But I think that on top of that, they need representation. So reaching the people that are on social media that can start stating their opinions and making comments on that, and just telling the story, the different perspective, because they're being told something else. So I think it's important that we start sharing our side of the story and how we view things, and just sharing the experiences of the disadvantaged community, so that we all work together and all the different organizations here work together to helping those that really need the help. That was it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. Augustine, are there any other public comments at this point?
That concludes public comment.
Okay, thank you. We will move to agenda item 6. I did want to let you know that if you're around in the afternoon, we're having a facilitated conversation with Angela Glover Blackwell. Larissa keeps looking at me because I break a lot of rules as a running this meeting, saying stuff I'm not supposed to say. But if you stick around for this afternoon, when I'm interviewing Angela, we'll say a lot of stuff you're not supposed to say. So it's really going to be a lot of fun. But I'm trying to be good here for you, Dr. Estes. So let's move to agenda item number 6. And that's next steps for staff action. And I think it's in part commission members of this committee giving some directions. But I'd love to start by asking Dr. Estes first, what did you hear today? That's sort of, and maybe yesterday evening as well, that's sort of new and that you are taking away as next steps.
Thank you, Commissioner Pastor. One piece that I want to bring in from last night, I think you mentioned this in your opening remarks, around the importance of humanity and dignity and making sure that we are constantly regrounding this racial equity work in the why and the who we serve, and being really concrete behind that. I think when you get embedded within a system, you sometimes focus on the processes within the system instead of the people you are serving. And you have to continuously uplift the humanity side of the work we're doing. And so that's the beauty of some of the in-person engagement that we do get to have as the commission, but it's not par for the course throughout the state. And so part of this is, how are we modeling for state agencies and departments of how to hold that humanity and dignity throughout the work, but also within a framework that they can carry forward. Going into what I'm starting to hear and kind of what are the things that we need to balance, I very much want to lift up recognizing the social political environment that we are operating in and the importance of being impactful and driving action. There are certain things that 6 months ago we may have been able to have a conversation about, but now it's just become increasingly hard. And we want to develop a tool that, or a framework that has tools and strategies in it that state agencies and departments, local government, nonprofit, for-profit can actually take and move work forward. And so making sure that something to think about is, do we need to clearly define terms? What would that look like? What type of supportive frameworks or thinking do we want to have embedded within there? I love the design principles that Stephen laid out for us, and how do we need to contextualize that in supporting how we identify what are those, very concrete, impactful key elements. Having context and understanding around some of the legal parameters, I think there is a lot of the quick retreat versus really understanding and being grounded in what you can do. And I think part of the role and the opportunity of the racial equity framework is to empower folks to see that there are things that you can continue to do, irrespective of what is kind of happening in the bigger scheme of things. Continuing to hear needs for plain language. We've had several presentations over the last few months on the importance of plain language and integrating that, whether it be from a conceptual perspective to increasing access to the communities that we are serving. I think the final thing I'll just add is the framework and the work of advancing racial equity is not a one and done. And so we have to be mindful of whatever content is included within this framework isn't the end all be all. And it may not be exactly what folks think or want, but how does it get us to take us the steps towards that bigger picture? And I'm very, very conscious of wanting to make sure that whatever we have is actionable and impactful, and it goes back to the need for those outcomes. That may not be realistic right now in the here and the now, but could be realistic in a year or two or 3 or 5. But how are we building something that is iterative and moves us in the right direction of where we are starting to see outcomes? So I'll stop there and happy to receive any additional next steps that you see feasible or fit. But our goal is to really take some of the information for today and really start to weave the tapestry of what we think should be moved forward in a way that, again, is impactful and concrete and actionable.
I think that was a very good summary, Dr. Estes. The thing that I would add that I think is in there, but I'd make it a little bit more explicit. I think in particular in the document that we put together, we need 3 examples of an equity policy that got implemented, that made a difference, that was accepted, that got state agencies excited because it was cool and new and data and accountable and made their jobs easier. Because I think we can have a lot of examples of things that are problems and challenges, but just having like 3 examples of totally cool policies that happened so that, the stumbling block for a lot of people is they see a problem, but if they don't see a solution, they're not going to work on it. And part of this is certainly our community members want to work on solutions, but we need to make sure that our state agencies want to work on it as well. And where there has been a payoff, where all of a sudden the work of the Energy Commission is that much better, where the work of the EPA is that much better, where the work of the Housing Department is that much better. Those would be really useful, almost like boxes in a report. They give people a sense of what's possible and where the win is. So with that, we are at a close. Is there anything else you want to add, Dr. Estes? Okay. So first, we talked about the next steps for the staff, but can I have the audience just give a big round of applause for the staff for putting this together? They've done a tremendous amount of work. So I want to thank the staff. I want to thank the commissioners, which, given that Yolanda left, means I'm just thanking myself. So way to go, Manuel. And of course, thank the public for joining us today. That brings us to meeting adjournment. We'll do this by common consent, since I'm the only commissioner here. It's a motion I agree with. And thanks for everyone being here. The meeting this afternoon starts at what time? 2? Okay. So there's time for lunch, a break. Then there's a full commission meeting. You get a chance to meet some of the other commissioners, including Traco Matthews, who's right here. But again, there'll also be a very interesting conversation with Angela Glover Blackwell, who's been an inspiration for equity fighters all over California. Thank you. And with that, this Framework Development Committee is adjourned.
And we will reconvene again at 2 o'clock in this same room. There is, if you go out this wall door here, there are restrooms as well as a cafeteria and a seating area if you want to spend your time there. The commission will be in here doing some team building work for lunch. So we ask that if you do continue to stay, that you just transition into the room next door. Thank you.